Okay, so this will be part two of the 8 aspects of writing. The first part was just looking at the three main approaches to writing, the kind of big ones that are the first people's first thoughts when they think of writing. So just as a recap, you can watch all the details or in a little more detail in that part one video. But just as a recap, the 8 aspects of writing are meant to be a mental model that allows you to piece together sometimes what feels like all these random parts or random facts about writing, random pieces of information and that sort of thing. Oh, I know about thesis statements. Oh, I know about research. Oh, I know about, and draw it all together and say, well, writing is this complex composite, and we want to have a model that allows us to understand and put together and process through systematically what it is. So that's why the 8 aspects of writing, in brief. The 8 aspects of writing, just to give you the quick version: aesthetic, linguistic, rhetorical, socio-cultural, scientific, technological, structural, analytical. That's not 8. Yes, it is. Okay. So, as we said in the previous video, the aesthetic aspect of writing deals with kind of your traditional thought process, deals with literature, creative writing, even kind of writing to express, emote, to get someone to experience something. Writing as a form of healing and emotion and that sort of connection also falls under kind of the aesthetic. Remember, aesthetics is the kind of its root meaning connects to the study of beauty, or how people find things fun or interesting or intriguing or fun to look at, like art for art's sake, that sort of thing. That doesn't mean literature and creative writing aren't those things, but that's their primary, so that's where they'll rest. And all of these 8 aspects are meant to be kind of porous boundary categories. So there are some things that cross the boundaries there. So that's the aesthetic. The linguistic deals with language, not just English writing, but language, the study of language, and how we communicate. And it will, traditionally people think of grammar when they think of linguistics or when they think of language, but the way linguists define grammar is a lot bigger too. And so we want to make sure we get away from the mindset of grammar as a series of rules we have to memorize, and think of it as a series of language practices we utilize, or we get to use, or we enact, or that can change by context. The only reason we tend to think of grammar as rules is because a lot of times we've been taught to do grammar or to think of language based on one particular variety of language, and in academic writing, that's often the standard written English, or sometimes what I call partially tongue-in-cheek sedimented white English or Western English. Hopefully that doesn't offend anyone, but there's research on it. Sorry, sociolinguistics. It's fun. So we've got the aesthetic, we've got the linguistic. Linguistic is the scientific study of language, usually dealing with how we build words and sentences and phrases, and how those things change meaning based on the web of context that are surrounding them. After that, we talked about the rhetorical aspect of writing. That deals with not just persuasive writing, which is what people traditionally think, based on an Aristotelian or Greco-Roman tradition, but it is how a writer accomplishes a writer's purpose, whatever that purpose is. It could be to persuade, it could be to entertain, it could be to express, or it could be to entertain, express, persuade, inform. Sorry. Or any complex purpose beyond that, or complex set of those dials. For instance, you think of a children's book, and you don't think it's got only one purpose. It is designed to entertain. It is that specific genre has the dials up on entertaining, on informing, and on persuading sometimes. So with the rhetorical aspect of writing, it's not just persuading. It's how a writer leverages what they know about everything to accomplish their rhetorical purpose. And a lot of times that everything is all the other aspects of writing. How do I know? What do I know about language practice that informs what I'm trying to do? And how do I enact that to accomplish my purpose? To attend to my audience, to respond to a specific exigence, fancy word, look it up. We'll talk about it later. So it's cool. all those fun things. Rhetorical. So we've got the aesthetic dealing with beauty, the linguistic dealing with language. We've got the rhetorical dealing with a writer's purpose. After that, we have 5 more aspects of writing. I'll cover 2 of them quickly because they're kind of they're so common they almost become second-hand parts of a writing class, or stuff we think of no matter what. But it's the structural and the analytical. The structural aspect of writing deals with how we organize or sequence words based on a particular mindset or rhetorical purpose. Pause. Still working on this. Got to figure it out. All right, so the structural aspect deals with organization, sequencing, what guides how we order things, first, second, third, fourth, etc. We can talk about structure when it pairs with linguistic at a word or sentence level, how things build structures, structurally what comes first and second, or more commonly we'll talk about structure and organization, or what Aristotle, either in Poetics or when he talks about rhetoric, it describes as arrangement, but it's the ordering of things and how we order things to make it make sense to our audience. So we'll talk about structure more often at a paragraph, at a chunk, at a full section or document level, or even how genres are structured, which are specific types of writing that are almost like, they're not formulaic, and don't get me in trouble, but they are the common patterns of different types of writing. And so a genre is any type or form of communication with socially agreed upon norms or conventions, and they often have a common structure or a specific structure that audiences will expect. So you have to keep that in mind. So when we talk about structural, it's how we organize, sequence, arrange things. Those are kind of the key words. Things like pi models, axes models, these can be helpful. Traditional models of the essay, Aristotle essentially said that any piece of writing should have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Thanks, Aristotle. You're smart. Anyway, a lot of times we, however, need to find alternate models or alternate ways of structuring. Sometimes we'll talk about things like transitional phrases, signaling, signposting, 3-prong essays, 5-paragraph essays. Don't do it unless you're only writing a 2 or 3 page paper. Trust me, we'll talk about it more later. Anyways, so after the structural, how we arrange and organize things, we shift to the analytical aspect of writing. This links to what is traditionally seen as critical thinking, logical fallacies, how we take a whole thing, a topic, whatever it is we're studying or writing about, how we pull it apart to understand the pieces, what their roles are in the larger system, and how they fit together as a whole to make that system we're analyzing function or break down. So that's an analytical aspect of writing. So when we talk about this, there are all different models we could use to analyze. Traditional models, simple mapping models like Venn diagrams, root cause analysis, fishbone diagramming, cause and effect, SWOT analysis, stakeholder analysis, all the different types of analysis. But also we want to think of analysis as kind of levels of cognition. Kind of fits in here a little bit, where we need to understand, to know what analysis is, we need to know how it fits in with some of the other types of cognitive activity. So when we talk about analysis as critical thinking, we need to know that reporting is usually a lot easier than analyzing, which requires us to interpret data. Then it's usually a little bit harder to evaluate what we've analyzed and make some sort of judgment claim if that's often a harder cognitive act. We need to understand that analysis and synthesis, that they go together, kind of work as a team. Analysis is breaking something down to understand it. Synthesis is trying to draw things together to see how they fit together as a whole, or how the pieces overlap. But that's the analytical aspect of writing in a nutshell. There's a lot of other stuff. We're not there yet. Cool. So after that, we've got the socio-cultural aspect of writing. If you notice, I move the order of these around sometimes because they are all equal parts. I only focused on the first 3 in a separate video because those are the most commonly seen. But when it comes to looking at a piece of writing, all of these are equal. So I move them around. But the socio-cultural aspect of writing deals with just that, the social context and the cultural context of that writing. So a writer has to understand that context to write into that context effectively. So this could be anything that is connected to traditional society, social structures, social beliefs, norms, conventions, keywords, beliefs, norms, conventions. Okay, but specifically connected to writing, sometimes we'll see the sociocultural show itself through formatting styles and guidelines, APA, IEEE, MLA, Chicago, all these different citation styles or kind of sociocultural norms of structuring a paper or formatting a paper or dealing with references and citations, all of that. Those are norms. They're not rules. They change by context, and we need to know that they change by context because people get grumpy when we do something different. If audiences have expectations, they're used to this normative thing, they're used to seeing something normal or conventional, and we do something different. We need to do that intentionally, not just because we don't know what the culture is. Those often read differently, and so we need to be aware and sensitive to the cultural context, the sociocultural context, and kind of blending that with the analytical. We'll start thinking about stakeholders and who our audience is or who might affect a thing we're trying to study. And so we can often bring in the norms of writing, genres, and things like that, while also trying to consider who our writing is impacting specifically in those other analytical things. Sometimes a model for to consider the sociocultural context is like PERMS, which is like the political context, the economic context, the religious context, the military context, and the social context. It's kind of blended. Or I like to, just going academic for a minute, Althusser's Ideological Apparatus is another good model. It's technically Marxist, but we're using it as or neo-Marxist. We're using it, so don't freak out. It's not communism. It's a way of analyzing society and its pieces. Talks about how we deal with media as a context, all that. So we'll be able to go more into that. This is the nutshell. This is the Greg's Notes, Cliff Notes version, Reader's Digest, however you want to think about it. So far we've covered the aesthetics, the aesthetic aspect of writing, the linguistic aspect of writing, rhetorical, structural, analytical, and sociocultural. That means we have two left. And those are often commonly linked in society, the scientific and the technological. However, we do need to make a distinction. They're combined because one often derives from the other. But let's start with the scientific, and then we'll see how technological, it goes back and forth. Okay, so the scientific aspect of writing is not just, or it is not traditional big S science. I'm not talking about writing as it relates to chemistry, biology, and all that fun stuff when I'm thinking of the 8 aspects of writing. I'm not even necessarily talking about specific genres of writing like IMRD format, though I could. The scientific aspect of writing is based on the root word for science, which is knowledge. So science is supposed to be knowledge. It's kind of like the word conscience. It's got conscience. And if you think of a conscience, what was Geppetto's job, or not Geppetto? What was Jiminy Cricket's job when he was hanging out with Pinocchio? His job was to give Pinocchio knowledge of right and wrong, kind of this ethical or moral right or wrong. So when we have a conscience, we're with knowledge often of a moral or ethical right or wrong. So the word science roots to knowledge, root word. So when we're writers thinking about the scientific aspect of writing, it's pretty cool. It's how we as writers deal with knowledge. How do we discover it? How do we critique it? How do we communicate it? How do we create it? So how does a writer deal with knowledge? And so a lot of times this links to what people know some practices of as research. Sometimes it's big research approaches. Is it qualitative or quantitative? Is it inductive or deductive? Is it specific ways of gathering data, like specific lab experiments, ethnographic analysis of a culture kind of thing, thick descriptions, these sorts of things. So when we think about the scientific aspect of writing, we want to be aware of how we're dealing with knowledge, what people consider truth, or how we deal with big T truth versus little t truth. there's a point where we blend the scientific and the sociocultural together so that we don't just have moral relativism and we don't just have kind of disassociated big T truth. We understand that truth is this complex thing, but that there are some things that no matter whether someone can measure it or not, it's true. But we can't necessarily make an argument persuasively from it. So it's complex, and that's why there are 8 aspects of writing. But the scientific aspect of writing deals with this thing called knowledge and research. So last but not least, since they're all equal, the technological aspect of writing deals with kind of 2 main branches of what we want to think about with writing. First, it's how we produce a text. So the process of production for a text. And that could be physical, that could be digital, that could be cognitive. So we may think about technologies, especially if you think of our brain as a technology, but let's not get too philosophical here just yet. But if we think about physical technologies producing a text, digital, I'm on Word, Microsoft Word, that sort of thing, versus a typewriter, and I'm using or how my brain works on developing content and invention and trying to discover what I'm even trying to say. Like all of that is the process of producing a text. But technologically, we're usually thinking more on the physical or digital side. There are a variety of writing technologies which kind of would go into that. So when we talk about the technological aspect of writing, we're dealing with the process of production and of a text, and that links to writing technologies, of which there are, call it 6. One of the big articles I use describes it as 3, but combines 2. So we'll start there. Brian Gabriel talks about manual technologies, mechanical technologies, electrical and electronic, and I split those up to distinguish between essentially hardware, software, and then we also want to think of technologies like writing systems, like linguistic technologies, and then we also want to think about archival technologies, which is how we store and hang on to writing once it's been produced. So it's a little bit kind of post-production technology, if that makes sense. That's still just the one vein. The other vein of the technological aspect of writing has to do with how our brain, our gray matter up top, how that processes things that we read. So we can borrow from literacy studies, but it's really more from technical communication, because we're not talking about literacy in the sense of like understanding language and like that traditional idea of language comprehension literacy. When we talk technological, we're talking about how our brain processes. It's called technological readability. How our brain processes information, what speed that process is at. How fast can we read or take in information? What is that process of cognitive uptake? That's kind of more what we're talking about when we talk about technological readability in that vein of the technological aspect of writing. How do we design a text so that a reader can take in information fast? And so that could be dealing with visual design, document design, a bunch of other cool things. Different techniques. There are all kinds of visual design techniques. You can get it from an artistic perspective. You can get it from a technological perspective. Sometimes we'll use those artistic techniques for technological reasons, trying to help cognitive upload. Things like accessibility falls under this category, whether someone so a lot of the technologies like text-to-speech or dictation software, Braille, like those sorts of things are this blended technology thing. How do we produce a text? But also things with visual design like bold headings, color, white space, even indenting tabs or spaces between words or using punctuation. Those are actually technologies of writing designed to enhance a reader's ability to take in information quickly. So that was more detail than I wanted to go into, but let's keep this under 20 minutes now. So again, we've got 8 aspects of writing. They're a composite system to help us understand what writing is, how its different pieces fit together, and that will hopefully give us this mental model to be able to place what sometimes feel like random facts about writing into a systematic approach to being a writer, so that we develop a more effective process to enhance our product so that we can be proud of it in the end. So again, 8 aspects of writing are aesthetic, linguistic, rhetorical, socio-cultural, structural, analytical, scientific, technological. 8. Thank you. Have a good one. Talk to you later.